Yeah, so the first thing to note is probably that I've never said it ever again since that one moment, particularly because of the outrage that it caused. And the funny thing about that is that millennials, which I'm at the tail end of, I'm 26 years old now, and I was born in 1994, which I think the millennial cutoff is like 95. So I have constantly been told my entire life that I'm a snowflake. I've been told my entire life that I'm naive and that I don't understand the world and that I've been wrapped in cotton wool and bubble wrap and everything else. So it's been really interesting, I guess, just to note in contrast to all of those things that have been punching down on me and my entire generation, that the one moment that something that is relatively innocuous is said, that it causes such an uprising. And I think perhaps that in and of itself is worthy of investigation. But I think it also probably speaks to the culture around the world, not just in Japan, not just here in New Zealand, but definitely as well in the UK and the US and Australia. The culture of perceived or requested, at least explicit, reverence for older generations. And that is the need for these things to be said, not necessarily to be practiced. So to say something like that out loud is very taboo. So how I came to actually saying it was to give everybody some background. The weekend beforehand, I was hanging out with my little brother he was 13, he's now 14, and he was showing me TikTok, and that's where I discovered it. And I just, was like, okay, this is interesting, and I guess what the kids are doing, because I was, I'm in my mid-20s now. So I then was in Parliament and I was speaking on the Zero Carbon Bill Now Act, which is a piece of law that I had spent around 9 months in the Environment Select Committee on, working through submissions from thousands of environmentalists, from oil companies who were trying to say, no, don't do climate action, from young people who were terrified about their future, for all of these different sectors of our society. So I was deeply invested in this. And at that time, we also had in Auckland here, where I'm based, which is the largest city in New Zealand, we had a march of tens of thousands of young people down Queen Street, which is one of our major streets. And it was the largest march that we've seen in approximately 10 or so years. And there was this palpable sense of urgency. And then I would go into Parliament down in Wellington, and it just wasn't mentioned. It didn't feel like any of that had resonated inside the halls of power. So there was almost this sense of disconnection and frustration in there. And I was sat listening through all of these speeches, and I was slot, I think, number 7 or so. And you constantly had people getting up and basically talking about things like the economy without any real cognizance or understanding of how the economy, in the words of a kind of eminent environmental thinker out of the US, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. So I was feeling incredibly frustrated listening to all of these things. So I got up and I was talking about the fact that the Zero Carbon Act sets in place a framework to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. 2050 and the year 2020 is obviously 30 years into the future. In the year 2050, me as the youngest member of Parliament will be 56 years old, but all of the kids who are currently marching on the streets will be under 50. And right now, our median age in Parliament, our average age rather, is around 50 years old. And how that doesn't inherently, but perhaps speaks to a certain extent, the timeframes and the horizons that people are thinking about decisions, and how it was just so important to actually listen to the kids who are out on the street, who nobody was acknowledging. And I was speaking about all of these things, and then I was heckled by who at that point in time was the climate change spokesperson for the National Party, the opposition, who actually became later, for a few months, the leader of the opposition. He was heckling me about my age and about all of these young people, and just yelling about something. And I just responded because it was top of mind, and I thought that it was kind of a funny thing to say. But then that got ripped entirely out of context and made something that it wasn't. So that's what my experience of this whole thing has been. It was fundamentally a sense of frustration in the moment, which a whole lot of people have begun to project things far larger than what it means onto it. And I have constantly said as well that, hey, look, I'm more than willing to apologize to anybody who is offended by that. But also, if your entire frustration listening to that speech is one moment that I said something responding to somebody who was yelling at me when I was talking about young people and their future, then maybe we need to evaluate our priorities.
Thought to have a peaceful but constructive long-term conversation with all generations. And
so I think that it's really valuable to note that I actually in looking at particularly the green movement have for a very long time been involved in taking on board the wisdom and advice of older generations, because they are the ones who paved the way for thinking about climate change and about women's rights and about gay rights and all of those things which have enabled me to be who I am and to occupy this place and this space in this time in politics. So I think that the best way to kind of interact is fundamentally the same way that we would interact with anybody else. So I think that it is dangerous to look at one throwaway statement and extrapolate an entire way of building a relationship on the basis of that. In fact, you can have a relationship that has those boiling points of angst. And in fact, I think you see that particularly towards younger generations as well. I'm now a constituency MP and I deal with, that's Member of Parliament, and I deal with people who say, all these young people are just so annoying and that they're all skateboarding around this church, for example, locally, and, we just need to ban them. And, I have to go and work through this issue with older people who live in that neighborhood and say, actually, maybe if we think about this in a way that delivers an outcome that works best for everybody, which is that these young people aren't actually going out there and causing trouble and doing dangerous things. They just want somewhere safe to be able to do these things. So again, it's kind of what I was speaking about before in terms of providing solutions that work for everybody, but you're not able to do that if you constantly are only willing to think from your perspective. So I invite trying to understand the position, the life experiences, and of course the actual experience and the wisdom that older people bring to the table. But I also will always premise it by saying that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. So that, again, is not to deride anything that those who've come before us have done, but it is to say that we have different life experiences and different skill sets, and the best way to solve these problems is to work together. But also realize that younger people, because they have a longer lifetime horizon, obviously have a greater sense of stake in the future. So to understand those tensions is to understand how best to navigate that relationship. Yeah, totally. I guess the key thing that I would say, and one of the many things that I've come to appreciate, particularly as a result of all the things that my dad taught me when I was growing up, who I regularly still talk to, is that no one person has a monopoly on truth. No one person has a monopoly on the best possible solutions. And the way that we find those solutions and the way that we build a society is by working with other people. So as far as that goes, I think it's also really important to be conscious of the idea of inspiration. Often we use the term inspiration as a reason to put somebody on a pedestal and say, that's something that only they can achieve and I can't do that. But it's also realizing that the very concept of inspiration isn't about separation, it's a mirror. If you're inspired by something or by somebody, you need to recognize that what you're seeing is something you admire about yourself and your potential and your capacity reflected back to you. So that's something to lean into, even though it might be scary. It's to realize that you have the potential to contribute in those same ways. And I guess just finally, if you don't know where to start, whether it is getting involved in politics or in community organization or activism or advocacy, you always can never go wrong by joining something bigger than yourself. Find your people and the people who share what we in New Zealand call kaupapa, which is your kind of values, your perspective, your principles. Find people who share those values and walk alongside them. And ironically, given the subject that we've spent a lot of time talking about today, also seek out those who have walked in those footsteps before you. Because people who have managed to retain a sense of need for radical, urgent change as they've got older are the most OG kind of fighters out there. And we have a huge amount to learn from them in terms of how long it actually takes to produce change. Because I look at a lot of younger people nowadays putting everything into about 6 months of work and advocacy and getting entirely burnt out and feeling as though nothing's going to change. But if we look at the history books, a lot of the change that we now take for granted took years, if not tens, decades and decades of years. So learning from those experiences of the people who retain those principles and those values now, despite being older, is one of the most valuable things we can do alongside building our own communities, because that's the only way that we'll survive.